Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ann Castle. I'm a senior fellow with the Getches-Wilkinson Center at the University of Colorado Law School. I've worn a few different hats in the Colorado River Basin, like many of the people here, and I don't need to go into that today. This session is a session of reflection. We're going to take a look back to the initiation of the conversations around the 2007 guidelines that have governed conditions and operations on this river for almost 20 years, and that we're now in the process of restructuring. And it's particularly appropriate to do that at the beginning of this conference, where so much of the focus is going to be on what the next operating regime is going to look like. This chart that is up on the screens is a really interesting one. It shows the various actions that have been taken on the river, various agreements, directives, since the beginning of this century to try to stem the tide of declines in the reservoirs. And you can see those actions mapped against the contents of Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And we know that each of these actions has made the problem better. They have tried to address the imbalance between supply and demand, but they haven't fully done it. And you can see that in the overall downward trend of the reservoir contents. And you can also see that the pace of these actions picks up as we get closer to the present, sort of gets more and more frantic as the reservoirs are declining and we're trying to balance the books. And of course, we're all waiting to see what the next vertical line on the right-hand side of this graph is going to look like, the next set of operating guidelines. And it's kind of like we're all camped out at the base of Mount Sinai, waiting for Moses to come down with the tablets and tell us what the next set of rules are. So hopefully we'll get a better picture of that. So as this chart shows, there's been a tremendous amount of work done over the past 20 years to respond to the hydrology, to try to balance our supply and demand equation. And it's useful for us now to think about what the goals and motivations were behind those various agreements and mandates, and to think about what worked and what didn't work, and what kind of worked, but not in the way we expected. And we can do that, learn our lessons from history, and not be doomed to repeat it. And there are no two better people to talk about those lessons learned than Jim Lochhead and Jeff Kightlinger. They were both in the rooms where it happened in 2007 and for subsequent agreements. And they were both instrumental in shaping the various components of those agreements and directives. And they both thought deeply about what worked and what didn't, and where we created beneficial incentives, and where the things we did worked at cross purposes for what we were trying to achieve. Jeff Kightlinger is the retired general manager for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California and was a leading voice for California in the shaping of the 2007 guidelines. And he has been involved in the follow-up agreements and directives that are part of the law of the river. Like many people in the Colorado River Basin, Jim Lochhead has worn a number of different hats. Most recently, he was the CEO and manager for Denver Water. And earlier, he was the director of Colorado's Department of Natural Resources and has, for many years, been the state of Colorado's representative on Colorado River matters. So to get us started, I'm going to ask Jim and Jeff to talk about what goals they had in mind when the 2007 guidelines were coming together, and to what extent those goals were achieved and where we fell short. So Jim, can I start with you?
Sure. Thank you. Great to be here. It's two of the senior citizens on the river, I guess. we can sit here in the cheap seats and just kind of throw stuff out there. As you can see from that chart, something happened in 2001 after we negotiated the surplus guidelines and California put together the QSA. And as the previous speaker noted, there was this intended glide path. We called it a soft landing for California. California actually just fell off the cliff in 2001. River took a nosedive. And you can see in around 2005, it really, things were looking serious. Arizona was very concerned about the prospect of shortages in Arizona. Nevada was concerned about its then lower intake and the elevation, critical elevation 1,000. And the lower basin, Arizona in particular, was advocating to the Secretary of the Interior to continue releases of 8.23 million acre feet from Lake Powell to Lake Mead so as to avoid continued shortages. The upper basin's position was, well, you know, we're in a drought too, and Lake Powell is going down, and we think that the Secretary should be justified in releasing less than 8.23 million acre feet from Lake Powell. So we got into a bit of an argument between the upper basin and the lower basin about whether 8.23 was a minimum release. There were threats of litigation. Colorado established a $10 million litigation fund, and we were kind of off to the races. Kind of sounds familiar. Secretary Norton at the time took account of the positions of the two basins, and she wrote a letter that essentially said, I as Secretary have the authority to release less than 8.23 million acre feet if I deem it necessary, but I'd like you all to get together by the end of 2007 and reach agreement, and if you don't, then I'll make a decision, and I suspect not anybody's going to like it. So she set that deadline. We had a number of discussions that were, again, quite acrimonious, but we managed to pull together and make an agreement in 2007 that ended up starting on coordinated operations between Powell and Meade, but also included a broader scope of initiatives that were developed within the lower basin around flexibility, managing water around shortages, and creating greater ability for the lower basin to manage for shortages. And lo and behold, we met that deadline and agreed on guidelines for the 2007 that we at the time knew were probably inadequate. We understood that they couldn't be permanent, that perpetual deals can't be made, and so we established 2026 as the time when those guidelines needed to be revisited. So, I don't know, Jeff, your perspective?
Can I,
yeah.
Before we go to Jeff, let me just ask you, Jim, from Colorado's perspective, what did you want to get out of the 2007 guidelines at the time?
One of the biggest issues for Colorado was the 8.23 release question, and whether that was a minimum or whether that was an objective release that the Secretary could manage above or below. And so the guidelines ended up including releases of as low as 7 million acre feet, as high as 9 and above, but as low as 7. And the upper basin in Colorado also supported the initiatives in the lower basin to develop ICS and this flexibility, because that allows the lower basin to not be so dependent on these releases from Lake Powell to Lake Mead, and allows greater flexibility within the lower basin to manage those shortage issues.
Great, thanks for that. And Jeff, give us California or lower basin perspective.
Well, as Jim said, we had worked pretty abrupt. There was 2000 to 2003 resulting in the California QSA. And what had happened in 2003 at the start of the year, Secretary Gail Norton took a 2x4 to the two large parties in California. The two major agencies, and a number of us share the river in California, but the two large entities are the Metropolitan Water District and the Imperial Irrigation District. And so on midnight of 2002, Metropolitan had its water order. A full metropolitan aqueduct carries 1.25 million acre feet, and the secretary said, we're reducing California to 4.4, and Metropolitan's order is reduced to 550,000 acre feet. So Metropolitan, overnight, lost 600,000 acre feet. At the same time, the secretary took IID's order and said, I'm disallowing that, and saying, pursuant to secretarial authority, IID is not using water carefully, wisely, beneficially, and I'm taking away a big chunk of IID's water order. And so you had this odd thing where both Metropolitan and IID had a big hole in their water order, and we both moved forward with a lot of pressure being applied. IID went to court. The court reversed the secretary's decision, but it became pretty clear that the Interior was going to continue to ratchet up the pressure on the California parties, and that resulted in us executing the QSA. We didn't have much time to relax because, as Jim said, looking at the river, we realized we had to come up with a new shortage sharing guidelines. Now, we'd always talked about shortages, but that was such a long-term theoretical issue. You got to remember, in 2000, you basically had 60 million acre feet in the system. It was full to the brim. And so even in 2003, when we were doing the QSA, shortages seemed forever. I mean, we had just spent a long time negotiating surplus guidelines. We had just finished writing surplus guidelines on how to share the surplus, how to give California that soft landing for Metropolitan, and all that was thrown out of the window. So pretty much we got to work, starting right away in 2005. California was busy implementing the QSA, so we had all the transfers, San Diego to IID to San Diego, canal linings that were taking place, litigation on all those fronts, and we also had Metropolitan was working with Palo Verde to implement a new land fallowing program. In the middle of all that, while we were doing all that work to implement that, we started working on the guidelines. And we really had three goals in the guidelines. First was come up with what are the rules going to be for shortage sharing? We had the concept of shortages. It was in it's in the compact, the upper basin delivery obligations. We have how that gets met in a shortage. We had the 1968 Act that California had managed to say, okay, the Central Arizona project is going to be junior to California's 4.4, but there were no guidelines on how to actually implement any of that. So that was goal one, work out what were the rules going to be and how a shortage was going to be shared. Goal two was particularly importance to Metropolitan and to California was Lake Mead banking. Metropolitan actually negotiated in its agreement with the secretary in 1928 the right to bank water in Lake Mead, and had never gotten the rules in place to do it. It's in Metropolitan's contract with the secretary, and it had been blocked for 60, 70 years, primarily by Arizona, that didn't want to have other states banking water in Lake Mead. So that was a critical path item for Metropolitan and California, and we did get it. We for whatever reason, we thought Lake Mead banking sounded too easy, so it became intentionally created a surplus. So, and then the third item is reservoir balancing. We never really thought about how we were going to manage less than a full system. So we were thinking that the smartest approach would be to balance between Powell and Mead as they would shrink, and how we would balance between them. So those were the three goals we had in negotiating, and to some extent we achieved them all. some worked better than others, and we'll get into that.
Yeah, tell us, what do you think, where did those goals, both Jim, the 8.23 release and the banking and mead and shortage sharing, how far did we get and where did we fall short?
Well, I think that from an operational standpoint, the balancing system between PAL and mead worked. One of the ideas behind the guidelines were to establish elevations at which certain releases would be made. And the thought behind that was to take politics out of the operation of the reservoirs and just have them be operated according to a set of rules. Before that point, there were literally no rules. It was up to the secretary on an annual basis to determine how much water was going to be released from Lake Mead, whether it was going to be normal, shortage, or surplus in the lower basin, how much was going to be released out of Lake Powell. So it's interesting because the year after, in 2008, when after the rules had been put in place, I think Lake Powell came within 1 foot of one of the trigger elevation points, and that became the pattern. It was either like a foot over, foot under, and it didn't really end up operating the way it was intended. I think that a rule curve type of a system is, in the end of the day, going to be a much better operational way to manage Powell and Mead. The other thing that happened was that, as well as the banking and the ICS system within the lower basin, began to sow the seeds of distrust between the upper basin and the lower basin. And some of you may remember a comment about a sweet spot in Lake Powell, and the idea that the lower basin or Arizona was manipulating its water deliveries so as to hit those certain elevation trigger points in Lake Powell and create more water coming down from Lake Powell to Lake Mead. And whether ICS was actually is actually based on real conservation measures, or whether it's simply replacing toilets in LA and then they create credits and that goes into Lake Mead, how is that being accounted for and policed? And unfortunately, I think those seeds of distrust continue to exist between the 7 states. And it's something that we're going to have to figure out how to manage. I think the final thing is that I think we kind of knew at the time, but it's turned out that clearly the shortages in the lower basin were not soon enough and they were not deep enough in order to meet the conditions and the hydrology that we've faced today.
Yeah, you know, on your first point, Jim, I remember when I was at the Department of the Interior, Terry Fulp taught me that if you set a bright line, whether it's an elevation or a volume, you will always end up within a foot or half a foot of it. So, Jeff.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's easy to say and point to the history as the system continued to decline, as the drought worsened, that we didn't pick the right numbers at the outset, and clearly we didn't do enough. Couple of things where, you know, as a reality, only Arizona realistic. I mean, Nevada took a little piece, and Arizona took the lion's share of the 2007 shortage. California, at that time, was, you know, in the recovery process of dealing with the QSA. California had just recently lost 600, 700,000 acre feet a year and was rebuilding all its ag to urban transfers to refill Met's aqueduct. And we basically said, we're not going to be part of this lift. And we pointed to the 1968 Act and go, Arizona, it's your job. And that ended up being the negotiation. We did, you know, you always have that saying, you know, the enemy of the good is perfect. We knew in some respects that we weren't planning for worst case scenarios, but we were planning for the likely scenarios. Terry Fulp, you know, God bless him, was out there doing his modeling and said, what we've negotiated should take care of 97% of the scenarios. Well, obviously we lived in the 3%, and we became, and worse, and, you know, -%. And it became pretty clear relatively soon what we had negotiated wasn't enough to manage it. So that was one of the lessons learned. But on the other hand, if we really focused on that last 3%, we probably wouldn't have gotten anything done. So at some point, you just have to take a cut and realize there's going to be more work to be done down the road. More agreements will have to be made. ICS. Honestly, Metropolitan was going to be the big user of ICS, and there was a really good, smart logic behind it. Up until then, I was the general manager at Metropolitan. How we operated our system is we ran an 8-pump, which is a full aqueduct, a full load, 8-pump flow, up until midnight, December 31st. And all we were doing was shifting water out of Lake Mead into Metropolitan's system, into Diamond Valley Lake, to store it. We were just moving it because it was use it or lose it. We could get no credit for it, so we moved every single drop of water of our entitlement from one storage spot to another. It could have easily stayed in Lake Mead, but since we got no credit for it, we took every drop. And that's not a smart way to run the system. It was much better leaving it in Mead where we could access it later at a time, so it would benefit Mead and do that. So we had worked out lots of complicated rules and requirements of what would count, what would not, and it basically worked. The interesting thing was we actually at Metropolitan thought 500,000 acre-feet is probably the most we'll ever put into storage, but since there was a lot of space in the reservoir, we negotiated for 1.5 million. And it actually worked so well, Metropolitan did end up putting 1.5 million acre-feet in. And that's been a tremendous benefit to the system, over 15 feet in elevation higher than otherwise the system would have been. So that's good reservoir management, that's smart. What we should have done, though, at the same time was make it operationally neutral, meaning that 15 feet meant Arizona didn't have to take shortages in a number of these years. But the reality is the system wasn't shortage, and we should have been taking those shortages. So we're keeping the system artificially high. Mm-hmm. And one of the lessons probably take away from it is that ICS is a good management tool, but we need operational neutrality, and we need to make sure the system's very clear and specific about what takes the appropriate credits for it. I think everything was appropriate, but everyone has to be satisfied, and so that was one of the things.
Yeah, that's great. And so that is a recap of the 2007 guidelines. Let's move on to the next set of agreements. And I think both of you were involved in the out-of-the-box discussions. Those were happening around 2012, 2013, and they led to a few other things. So if you could talk about, I think the motivation is clear. What was done in 2007 wasn't enough, and you can see that from the chart. And we needed to do more in order to balance the system. But talk a little bit, Jeff, about those discussions, what they led to, and how well they worked.
Well, as soon as 2012 timeframe, so probably just less than 5 years after we'd finally done the first shortage sharing, it was clear to everybody more is going to be needed. The system was, as you can see from that chart, is dropping pretty rapidly. And so we started discussions. Ultimately, that led to the drought contingency plan, which was an add-on in 2019. But there was a lot of good discussion that took place among all the parties on the river. And one of the things, we had what we called the out-of-the-box thinking, which was just, we put together a lot of smart people who worked on the river and put them in a room and just said, no bad ideas. Let's start putting together a list of all the things out there. Really start canvassing, from desal projects to reclaimed water projects to groundwater reclaim, search, everything we could think of that would help augment, supplement, wherever it could be used to fund and canvass and put that together. And that was a really good exercise. We still couldn't reach agreement on how to manage things, and eventually we got to the drought contingency plan. But a lot of good thinking was taking place over these years.
Yeah, there was, and I guess one of the things that came out of that was that it was staff from the 7 basin states, from the major water utilities and water districts in the basin. So it was truly a group effort in terms of the brainstorming that was done in that. And it's kind of interesting to look back at some of the recommendations that were made in 2012. For example, one of the recommendations of the staff was a recognition that there needed to be steeper and deeper reductions in the lower basin. In fact, they recommended a reduction of 900,000 acre-feet by 2018 in the lower basin. And of course, the lower basin now has on the table 1.5 million acre-feet of shortages in the lower basin. They also recommended actions to create what they called variable yield from the upper basin, which involved the monthly reoperation of Flaming Gorge Reservoir when Lake Powell was at certain elevations, and a system water bank when Powell was at a certain elevation that would create up to 200,000 acre-feet of water per year from the upper basin to go into Lake Powell. Now, if any of that sounds familiar to you, those are puzzle pieces that are still sitting on the table today. The out-of-the-box group also made a number of recommendations about what was necessary to balance the system. They recommended to the principals that lower basin reductions help Lake Mead, but not Lake Powell, that upper basin reductions help Lake Powell, but not Lake Mead, but if you have reductions throughout the whole basin, then both Mead and Powell will benefit. They also recognize that there are large volumes of water that need to be created in order to bend the curve and begin to rebuild storage in the system. They stated to the principals that there are no painless options available. It involves pain for everybody. And they also stated that the time to address these issues is short. This was in 2012 again. The states became stuck. They couldn't, the group really had no mandate other than to come up with ideas. The assumption was that then the ideas would be translated into action, and the states were unable to take that list. Literally, I don't know, 3 or 4 pages in a spreadsheet of, I don't know how many ideas, but a lot of them that are still, I think, valuable today. And so nothing came of it.
And so we've talked about how part of the reason that we're seeing these declines in the reservoirs is that cuts weren't deep enough, weren't soon enough. Are there other things that you have observed that have led us to this point that you think we should be learning from? Jeff?
Yes. Yes. When we knew in 2012 and we started this out-of-the-box thinking group, but there was no mandate for action and it was too painful. And we didn't get anywhere until it took us 7 years to put together the drought contingency plan. And it didn't follow through on all the ideas that were there, and it didn't really look into the creation of new water. All it simply did was layer on another round of cuts to be shared. At this time, California, for the first time, said, okay, we will also share in the cuts. And that was actually that was a very significant concession. It was a big deal. I mean, it was California basically saying, yes, we understand the 1968 Act makes the CAP junior, but we also recognize the Secretary's not going to wipe out Phoenix and Tucson and other places entirely for California. So it was, we need to share in this, and California will step up and take a share of cuts, but in recognition of the 68 Act, Arizona is going to take a slightly larger share. And that was the balance that was achieved. And that in and of itself was a big first step, and that was a tough, political first step for California. So, but it took 7 years, and it shouldn't have been. One of the things we're going to have to do in a system that is now starting to look volatile, I mean, one of the things we thought, it's so huge, 60 million acre-feet of storage. We've been mining that storage for 25 years. We never really think of volatility on this Colorado. You can see a drought coming and have years of storage to work with it. But we basically wasted that time, and now we no longer have that. So we needed to move on these things in a much more timely fashion, and that's true today.
Jim, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just note that following that out of the box, there were a group of municipalities in the basin that got together, Metropolitan, Denver Water, Southern Nevada, Central Arizona Project, and worked with Reclamation to develop the System Conservation Pilot Program. That was something that wasn't originally developed by Reclamation. It was developed by these utilities out of frustration that the basin states weren't actually doing anything. And we decided we're going to put some money out and actually try something that may or may not work, but we're willing to make that investment to create system water, to benefit the system, to test the idea of whether voluntary, temporary, compensated reductions in demand throughout the basin could actually create some water. And I think that really helped in the discussions on the drought contingency plan, and remains something that is, I think, going to be necessary going forward, is a funding mechanism and a mechanism to create voluntary, temporary, compensated reductions in use.
That was a really good example of just trying experimentation. Let's just try and see if some things work, and instead of waiting for these long, complicated, multi-state federal agreements. And I remember at one point when we were talking about, who people would come in and say, I will fallow some of my farmland or do whatever, or or shift to something else and makes water available, and then we, the urbans, would pay for it, and it wouldn't go to us, it would be in the system. And I remember Pat Terrell of Wyoming saying, I'm never going to allow you guys to do this in my state, and that was his first reaction. And then finally said, you know what, there is no one in Wyoming that would ever sign up for this, so I'm going to allow it just because I know it won't happen. And a year later, he came and said, actually, ranchers and farmers really liked it. So, who knew? But he goes, I learned from that. He goes, I never really thought there'd be anybody who would ever do this. And they actually liked it. They liked the money, and they liked the flexibility. So it was a good lesson for us that these types of programs could work, and more experimentation, less legalistic thinking is what's really kind of needed in these challenging periods.
Okay, so that is a great segue to my last question, which is, I think, something that we all want to hear. I know I want to hear. I want to hear your recommendations. So based on observations over the last 25 years and the lessons that we learned over that time, what advice do you have for the Colorado River community going forward? Jim?
Well, from the cheap seats, I guess, here. I mentioned that at various stages in the negotiations over the last 30 years, there's been posturing, there's been acrimony, there's been threats of litigation, but at some point you need to stop the blame game, and you need to sit down and figure out what can be done, and what are the solutions that benefit the entire basin. I think that we collectively need to be thinking about the potential of what can be done versus why things can't be done. And, Jeff mentioned experimentation, moving forward. And part of that is not getting hung up on the long term, but to think what can we do at least in the short term, particularly now that we're at the end of this negotiation period where the Secretary has to make some kind of a decision next year about what's going to be operational moving forward. The states have an opportunity to do something, but I think that at this point in time, the opportunity is not there and the time is not there to make a long-term permanent deal. I think that there needs to be leadership among the basin states that isn't present today. The letters that were recently written by the governors of Nevada and Utah, I think, are encouraging in that they reflect a concern on behalf of two governors that the states really need to get to work and get to work quickly to move forward on an agreement. And for example, if in terms of what needs to be put together to put an entire package together that the states, I think, and the Colorado River Basin community can support, we need an operating curve for Powell and Meade. I think that's relatively easy. The states can quickly agree on what that curve might be because it frankly doesn't matter at this point in time, and the differences between the two basins, I think, are not very large. The lower basin has already put on the table 1.5 million acre-feet of shortages. I would suggest that we accept that as a starting point, recognizing again that it may not be enough, hydrology may overtake us, but let's try 1.5 million acre-feet first and then move forward from there. I think that the upper basin needs to, as recommended by the out-of-the-box group, develop a program to provide contributions of defined goals. The states don't have the authority to do mandatory caps or mandatory contributions or mandatory reductions, but there can be programs similar to System Conservation Pilot that can create meaningful amounts of water to contribute to the basin and to these solutions. The states in the United States will need to work with Mexico toward an additional minute to cement Mexico's participation in this solution. There needs to be, I think, both federal and state legislation that would authorize the implementation of these programs, as well as create a funding mechanism for sustainable long-term funding to manage through the reductions, and also to create conservation pools in federal reservoirs that can be managed with both state water as well as tribal water and participation. There needs to be commitments for no litigation during the period that the parties are working together. There needs to be benchmarks of both basins simultaneously working in parallel to be solving these problems and goals for how they're going to implement those tools. And they need to create opportunities to, for example, take the list that was done by the out-of-the-box group and figure out what can we implement today, as opposed to arguing about why we can't do things and why it's the other basin's problem or the other state's problem that we haven't solved this problem. Time is short, but a framework around some key principles, I think, can be put in place relatively quickly, and could be announced at the 7-state panel on Wednesday.
Perfect. That was a great list and a great challenge. We'll see what happens. Jeff.
Well, since Jim kind of ran through the list, I'm going to say we're going to follow the Nike slogan and just do it. Seriously, we've had the 1.5 million acre-foot more or less divided between Arizona, California, and Nevada, and talking with Mexico. So let's just do it. We've had that for 2 years now, and we haven't started it. In 2019, the Upper Basin was going to start developing a conservation program and how to put water in Powell and figure out how to do it. I haven't seen any progress on it, but I'm like, just do it. Let's just keep it small. Do 100,000 acre-feet. Let's just do it, and we'll do the 1.5 million, and let's get this thing going. Because time is short, and so just do it.
Okay, and another challenge. Well, I think we can tell from this discussion, from looking at the chart, there's been such a huge amount of good faith effort put into these various agreements and put into the discussions that didn't come to agreement. And there's always going to be unanticipated consequences that we will have to deal with, and sometimes there will be anticipated consequences that we just couldn't work out, couldn't come to agreement around. But I think we all have great respect for the federal and state principals who are doing this work of trying to give us a balanced river, they have really, really hard jobs. So having listened to this discussion, sort of recapped what went on during the past 20 years, I think we all do need to learn those lessons and not repeat the mistakes of history. And whatever comes to pass, whether it's an agreement among the states or a federal directive, we know that we have to have provisions that do enough to balance the system. We don't want to repeat the mistake of not doing enough to address the conditions that we know are gonna confront us, that we're dealing with right now. So any agreement, any directive has to be judged against that metric. And again, whether it's agreement or directive, we know that we need to live within our hydrologic means. We need to honor our obligations to Native American tribes, and we need to ensure that this river continues to be a living resource that we can all count on for years to come. So with that, would you please join me in thanking Jim and Jeff for their comments today? And I think we're adjourned.